The men had been trying to catch him for 3 days. When they finally cornered him against the fence at the eastern edge of the property, there were 4 of them, armed with ropes and enough collective experience with difficult horses to fill a career. And still, the roan stallion had made every single one of them look like they had never seen a horse before in their lives. He had a scar along his left shoulder that nobody could explain. He had never once stood still long enough for anyone to put a hand on him. The rancher who owned the land he had wandered onto called him a problem horse, called him dangerous, called him the kind of animal that you didn't try to reason with. Harlan, the youngest of the ranch hands, had made the mistake of getting too close 2 days earlier, and was still wearing a bandage on his forearm to prove it. So when the roan stallion turned his back on the 4 men that morning and walked in the opposite direction, nobody followed him right away. They assumed he was bolting. They assumed he was doing what he had done every time before, which was escape. They watched him move through the tall grass toward the creek line, and they let out breath they had been holding. And one of them made a comment about how it was going to be another long day. What none of them understood yet, what none of them could have known, was that the horse was not running away. He had found something. And what he had found was a 6-year-old girl named Wren, lying face down in 4 inches of water at the bottom of a creek bed, not moving. That morning had started the way most mornings started at the Callum Voss property on the eastern edge of Bitterroot Valley in Montana. The sun came up slow behind the mountains. The air had that particular cold sharpness that only exists in early October at altitude, the kind that makes every breath feel like the first one you've taken all day. Callum had been awake since 5, as he usually was, drinking coffee on the porch of the house his grandfather had built, watching the light change on the ridgeline and running through his mental list of what needed doing before the first frost. He had not thought about the little girl next door. That was not because he didn't care about her. Callum Voss was many things, some of them harder than they needed to be, but indifferent to children was not one of them. He had simply not thought about her the way you don't think about a neighbor's child. When you have a rogue horse on your property and a fence line that needs mending and a water pump that has been making a sound it shouldn't for 2 weeks. He had seen Wren a handful of times in the past year, since her mother Isolde had moved into the small rental property that shared his eastern fence. He knew the girl was quiet, knew she had a way of appearing in places without making any sound, knew she had dark hair that went in every direction and eyes that seemed to be taking notes on everything they saw. He had spoken to her exactly twice. Both times she had answered him with a single word, then gone back to whatever she had been looking at. She was 6 years old. She would turn 7 in November. Her mother told Callum this the one time they had spoken at any length. Leaning against the gate that divided their properties, Isolde, with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug and her eyes slightly more tired than they had been the week before. What Callum did not know, what Isolde herself had only half admitted to herself, was that Wren had been walking in her sleep. It had started 3 weeks before the morning in question. Isolde had heard a sound at 2 in the morning, a soft movement in the hallway, and had gotten up to find Wren standing at the back door with her hand on the handle, eyes open, completely asleep. Isolde had steered her gently back to bed, and Wren had not woken up. In the morning, she remembered nothing. It happened again, 4 nights later, and again the week after that. Isolde had mentioned it to the pediatrician in Missoula during a routine appointment, and the doctor had said what pediatricians often say about sleepwalking in young children, which was that it was common, that it was usually triggered by fatigue or stress or change in routine, that most children grew out of it, that the main concern was safety, that she should make sure doors were locked and stairways were gated. Isolde had nodded. She had put a new lock on the back door, high up, where small hands couldn't reach. What she had not anticipated was the window. The bedroom window in Wren's room opened to a low drop onto the side garden. Isolde had never thought of it as a risk because it had a latch, and Wren had never once in her life shown any interest in climbing out of windows. In the daylight, with her eyes open and her mind present, Wren was careful and deliberate in everything she did. She was not a child who tested limits or pushed boundaries. She was a child who observed, but the version of Wren that moved through the house at night, with her eyes open and her mind somewhere else entirely, did not share those qualities. That morning, while Callum was on his porch and his ranch hands were girding themselves for another attempt at the roan stallion, Wren had been in her bed. Isolde had checked on her at 6:30. She had looked peaceful. The stuffed horse she always slept with, The small, worn thing with the reddish-brown coat and the mane she had rubbed down to almost nothing from years of holding it was tucked under her arm. By 7:15, Wren was gone. The window latch had been open. The grass below it was pressed flat in one small spot, and Isolde, who discovered this at 7:30 when she went to wake Wren for breakfast, stood in the empty room for a full 30 seconds before her body understood what her mind was already telling her. She ran. The back of the property was all grass, and then fence, and then more grass, and then the creek. It was barely 300 meters, but in that moment it felt like the kind of distance that changes depending on what you're running toward. Isolde called Wren's name twice, and then stopped calling because she needed to hear. And the morning was quiet in the way mornings are quiet when they are about to stop being quiet forever. She did not find Wren. What she found was the gate in the fence that separated her property from Callum's, which was open. And then she found, at the top of the small rise that led down to the creek, something that stopped her entirely. The roan stallion was standing in the creek bed. He was standing at the point where the bank dropped down sharply, where the water ran fastest and deepest, and he was standing very still. That detail lodged in Isolde's mind immediately, because she had heard enough from Callum about this horse to know that standing still was not something he did. And yet, there he was, absolutely motionless, his head down low, his body angled slightly, as though he was blocking something from the current. Isolde ran down the bank, and her feet hit the water, and she saw Wren. The girl was face down in the creek, her cheek turned just barely to one side, the water moving around her small body. The roan stallion's front hooves were planted on either side of her, not touching her, just there, close enough that his chest was creating a break in the current, close enough that his body heat was reaching her. Wren was breathing. Isolde could see it in the faint rise and fall of her daughter's back, shallow and slow, but there she pulled Wren out of the water and held her, and Wren made a sound that was not a word but was enough. She was cold. She was deeply, alarmingly cold in the way that happens fast in October Creek water. Her lips had a color to them that made Isolde's hands shake. The roan stallion did not move while any of this happened. He stood in the water, watching, and the only sound was the creek and Isolde's voice saying her daughter's name over and over again, and the wet shift of the horse's weight as he turned his enormous head and looked at them both with an expression that had no name in human language. Callum heard Isolde screaming his name from across 2 properties. He covered that distance faster than a man his age had any right to, and he was on his phone to emergency services before he had reached the creek bank. And by the time he slid down into the water, the roan stallion had stepped back exactly 1 pace and was watching from 2 feet away. Harlan, who had come running behind Callum, would later say that he had expected the horse to bolt when the commotion started. He had expected the animal to do what he always did, which was put as much distance between himself and human beings as possible. Instead, the stallion had stood in the creek while paramedics came down the bank, while Wren was lifted onto a stretcher, while radios crackled and voices overlapped, and he had not moved until the last person had climbed back up the bank. Then he had walked to the far end of the creek and stood under the cottonwoods and done nothing in particular, as though he had finished a task and was resting. Wren was in the hospital for 2 nights. She had mild hypothermia and a small cut on her forehead from where she had fallen. But nothing worse than that. The doctor who treated her told Isolde that the temperature of the water and the length of time Wren had been in it, based on when she had last been seen and when she was found, meant that the position she had been lying in mattered enormously. Face down in moving water, a child can drown in minutes. Face turned, with something interrupting the current, the margin widens. He said this carefully, looking at a point slightly to the left of Isolde's face. And then he said that they had been lucky, which was what doctors said when they meant something else entirely, when they meant that the thing that had stood between an outcome and a different outcome was not medicine or intervention or anything that could be planned for. Isolde said thank you. She sat down when he left the room. She sat down because her legs had been waiting for permission. Callum drove to the hospital that afternoon. He had not been asked and had not called ahead. He had simply been on the road to Missoula for feed when he found himself taking the exit for the hospital. And then he was in the parking lot, and then he was in the corridor outside, the pediatric ward, with his hat in his hands, feeling like a man who had not thought this through. Isolde came out to meet him when the nurse told her someone was asking about Wren at the desk. She stood in the corridor and looked at Callum, and something about his expression, the particular set of a man who is not accustomed to not knowing what to say and is trying not to show it, made her eyes fill in a way she had been holding off all day. She told him Wren was going to be fine. He nodded. He told her he was glad. There was a pause that neither of them knew how to close. Then Callum said, quietly, that whatever the horse had done out there, he was not going to pretend he understood it, but that he was grateful for it. He said that, like it cost him something to say it. Isolde said she was too. He drove back to the ranch and did not tell anyone where he had been. The doctor who treated her told Isolde that the temperature of the water and the length of time Wren had been in it, based on when she had last been seen and when she was found, meant that the position she had been lying in mattered enormously. Face down in moving water, a child can drown in minutes. Face turned, with something interrupting the current, the margin widens. The doctor did not say the horse had saved her life. He said the circumstances had been such that she had been protected from the worst outcomes. He spoke carefully, the way doctors do when the facts don't quite fit into any of the boxes they have been trained to use. Isolde sat beside Wren's hospital bed that first night and held the stuffed horse on her lap and did not sleep. She turned the small, worn toy over in her hands and looked at its reddish-brown coat, which had faded unevenly from years of being held, and she thought about color. She had bought that toy horse before Wren was born. She had bought it at a market stall in Missoula when she was 6 months pregnant, and she had bought it because something about the colors stopped her. She didn't know, standing at that market stall, what Wren would look like or who she would become. She had bought it on instinct, the way you buy something that feels like it belongs to someone who doesn't exist yet. Wren had been born 6 weeks early. She had spent 11 days in the neonatal unit, in an incubator with tubes and monitors, and the particular silence of a place where everyone is trying very hard. Isolde had been allowed to place one small item in the incubator with her. She had placed the stuffed horse. Wren had not slept without it since. Isolde sat in the hospital chair and looked at the color of that toy, at the specific shade of reddish-brown that she had never had a word for, but had always recognized, and she felt something that was not quite a thought and not quite a feeling settle in her chest. The roan stallion was that exact color. She did not know if that meant anything. She would never know if it meant anything. But she sat with it through the night, and by morning it had become part of the story she carried. The kind of detail that attaches itself to your memory and does not let go. In the days that followed, Callum Voss did something he had not expected to do. He stopped trying to remove the roan stallion from his property. This was not a simple decision. The horse had cost him time and money and one ranch hand's forearm. There were practical reasons to want him gone and no obvious practical reasons to keep him. Callum was a practical man. He had spent 40 years making practical decisions on that land, and most of them had served him well. But something about the morning at the creek had shifted something he couldn't name. He had stood on that bank and watched a horse that had never allowed a human within 10 feet of him stand motionless in cold water beside an unconscious child, and he had not known what to do with that image. It had not fit into anything he already knew. So he left the horse alone. He told Harlan and the others to leave him alone. He went about his work and watched from a distance and waited to understand what he was looking at. What he observed over the following 2 weeks was this. The roan stallion had settled. He was not the same animal he had been when he arrived. He still kept his distance from people. He still watched everything with that particular attention that had unnerved every ranch hand who had encountered him. But the frantic energy, the constant motion, the low-level aggression that had made him impossible to approach, all of that had quieted. He had chosen a spot near the eastern fence, near the gate between Callum's property and he spent most of his time there. Grazing, standing, watching. Harlan noticed it first, but didn't say anything for several days, because he was not sure how to say it without sounding like someone who had been spending too much time alone in the cold. What he noticed was that Russ seemed to orient toward the sound of Isolde's car in the mornings, toward the sound of the back door of the small rental house opening and closing, toward any indication of movement on the other side of the fence. He would lift his head and turn. not with alarm, with something that looked more like attention than instinct. Harlan mentioned it eventually, casually, while he and Callum were working on the south gate. He said it like it was a small thing, something that might be nothing. Callum kept working, and then said he had noticed it too. Neither of them said anything else about it. Nobody knew where Rust had come from. That was the part of the story that people in the valley would argue about for years. He had appeared on Callum's land in late August, walking in through a gap in the northern fence line that Harlan had been meaning to patch for 2 weeks. The first time anyone saw him, he was standing in the north pasture in the early morning mist, and Harlan, who had driven out to check the water troughs, had stopped the truck and stared at him for a full minute before getting on the radio to tell Callum that something unusual had arrived. Callum had come out and studied the horse from a distance and felt two things simultaneously. The first was recognition, not of the specific horse, who he had never seen before, but of something in the type, something in the way the animal held himself, the particular quality of alertness that a horse acquires when it has spent years making its own decisions about when to run and when to stay. He had seen that quality in ranch horses that had been badly used, and in wild horses that had been briefly captured, and in horses that had simply spent too long alone. It was the quality of an animal that had learned to trust its own reading of the world more than any human interpretation of it. The second thing he felt was that this horse was not going to be easy. He had been right about that in every way he had not anticipated. The roan stallion had eaten Callum's grass and drunk his water, and evaded every attempt at contact with an efficiency that bordered on contemptuous. He had not been aggressive in the beginning. He had simply been unavailable. When the men came out with ropes, he put distance between them without urgency, as though the whole exercise bored him. When Harlan had cornered him against the water tank that second day, the horse had warned him once, a clear and specific warning that Harlan had not read in time, and the forearm had been the result. After that, Callum had called in help, and after 3 days of escalating frustration, they had been on the verge of something they weren't sure they wanted to be on the verge of when the horse had turned away from the men at the eastern fence and walked toward the creek. The part that nobody talked about much afterward was what the men had been discussing just before he walked away. They had been talking about their options. They had been talking about what you do with a horse that can't be caught and is becoming a liability, and not all of the options they had been discussing were good ones. Rust had walked away from that conversation as though he had heard every word. Petra Ame, the large animal veterinarian from Missoula, who had been called in twice before when there had been questions about the stallion's health, came out to assess him. She was a compact woman in her 50s, with the kind of calm that animals respond to before they respond to anything else, and she spent a long time just watching the horse from a distance before she said anything. She told Callum that the horse was not dangerous in the way the word was typically used. She said there was a difference between an animal that had been mistreated and an animal that had never been given a reason to trust, and that the behavioral patterns she was seeing pointed more toward the second than the first. She said she thought the horse had been wild for most of his life, that the scar on his shoulder looked like an old injury from before any human contact, and that what they were seeing now, the settling, the chosen location, was an animal making a decision about proximity. He was deciding how close he was willing to be. That was not something Petra said often about horses, because it implied a level of agency that made people uncomfortable. But she said it that day, standing at Callum's fence, watching the roan stallion watch them back, and Callum did not argue with her. Wren came home from the hospital on a Wednesday. She walked into the backyard that afternoon, still moving slightly carefully the way children do when their body has recently reminded them it is fragile. And she stood at the fence and looked toward Callum's property. The roan stallion was at the eastern fence, as he usually was. He was perhaps 150 meters away. At that distance, he would have been difficult to see clearly, but he turned his head when Wren appeared. Callum, who was mending fence on the other side of his property, did not see this happen. Harlan, who was nearby, saw it and didn't say anything, because he wasn't sure anyone would believe him. Wren stood at the fence for a long time. She was wearing her coat and her boots, and she had her stuffed horse tucked under one arm. She stood there until Isolde called her in for dinner, and she went in without argument, which was not how she usually responded to being called in. That night, she asked Isolde what the horse's name was. Isolde said she didn't think he had won, not one that people used. Wren thought about this for a moment, and then said, with the particular certainty of children making important decisions, that she thought his name was Rust. Not because of the color, she said. She said it with a kind of specificity that surprised Isolde. Not because of the color, but because of how he sounded when he moved. Like something that had been left out in the weather for a long time and was still working anyway. Isolde did not know what to do with that. She kissed Wren's forehead and turned out the light and stood in the hallway for a moment longer than she needed to. Callum heard about the name the following day, relayed through Isolde with a slightly apologetic expression, as though naming someone else's problem, horse might be considered an imposition. Callum had laughed, which surprised them both. He told Isolde it was the best name he'd heard for the animal, and she could tell Wren she was right about all of it. What happened over the following months was not dramatic in the way that the morning at the creek had been dramatic. It was quiet and gradual, and the kind of thing that is easy to miss if you are not paying attention. Wren began spending time at the fence, not trying to approach the horse, not calling to him or offering anything, just being there, in the way that children sometimes are simply present without agenda, sitting on the bottom rail of the fence with her stuffed horse in her lap, watching the field. Rust, who had spent weeks maintaining a 150-meter distance from every human on the property, began to drift closer, a few meters closer each day, or not every day, and sometimes farther again, as though he was making the decision slowly and kept changing his mind and then coming back to it. By the end of October, he was grazing at 50 meters. By the second week of November, which was the week of Wren's 7th birthday, he was close enough that if she had reached through the fence, she could almost have touched him. She did not reach through the fence. Callum watched all of this from careful distances. He had started to feel something he hadn't expected to feel, which was invested. He was invested in what was happening at his eastern fence, the way he had once been invested in things that mattered to him, and had since learned to hold less tightly. He was a man who had spent a long time managing the distance between himself and things he didn't want to lose again. And watching a wild horse close that distance, slowly and on his own terms, was doing something to him he could not fully explain. His wife had died 4 years ago. He had not spoken about her to anyone on the property. The grief had settled into him, the way water settles into limestone. Finding the paths of least resistance, reshaping things from the inside. He was functional. He was competent. He had kept the ranch going and kept his people employed and kept the land in the condition it deserved. But there were parts of him that had gone quiet in a way he had stopped expecting to change. He found himself thinking about her when he watched Wren at the fence. Not because they were similar. His wife had been a grown woman with a large laugh and opinions about everything and no patience for winter. And Wren was a small, silent 7-year-old who sat on a fence rail and watched a horse. But something in the quality of the attention was the same. His wife had always had the capacity to be fully present with something, to give it her complete focus without performing that focus. And it was rare enough in the world that he had not seen it many times since losing her. Wren had it. This small girl at the fence had it entirely. On the morning of Wren's birthday, Callum walked to the eastern fence before the sun was fully up. He had something in his coat pocket that he had been carrying for 2 days without knowing exactly what he intended to do with it. He stood at the fence and looked across at the field where Rust grazed in the early light, and Rust saw him immediately. The horse raised his head and looked at Callum with the steady attention he gave everything. And then he did something he had never done in any of the weeks Callum had been watching him. He walked toward the fence, not fast, not in the tentative, once-to-pan-stop way he had been approaching Wren. Directly, at a deliberate pace, head low, as though he had made a decision some time ago and was only now getting around to following through on it. He stopped at the fence, 4 feet away from Callum, and stood. Callum did not move. He barely breathed. He was a man who knew horses, had known them all his life. And he knew that this moment was the kind that you do not disturb with anything as large as a gesture or as loud as a word. He took the thing from his coat pocket slowly. It was a photograph, small and slightly creased. A photograph of a roan horse he had owned 20 years ago. a mare named Catty who had been the best horse he had ever worked with and who he had loved without qualification. He had no idea why he had taken it from the drawer where it had lived for 2 decades and carried it to the fence. He was not a man who believed in signs or connections that couldn't be explained. He was not the kind of man who looked at a photograph and thought the world was trying to tell him something. He looked at Rust's face. He looked at Catty's face in the photograph. Something in the eyes, something in the particular way they both held their attention. Not identical, but related in the way that a sound can be related to another sound without being the same sound. He put the photograph back in his pocket. Rust stood at the fence for another minute, and then turned and walked back into the field, unhurried, and resumed grazing. Callum stood at the fence for a long time after that. The sun came up the rest of the way. The morning got loud, with birds and the distant sound of Harlan starting the truck by the barn. Callum stood there and felt something that had been very still inside him for 4 years shift. Who slightly, just enough, to notice. He did not tell anyone about it. Wren's birthday party was small. Isolde had invited 2 children from town, and Callum, who had not been to a birthday party in some time, but had accepted with an ease that surprised him. He sat at the kitchen table in Isolde's small house and ate cake that Wren had helped decorate, which meant it was unevenly frosted and had an unclear number of horses on it in colored sugar. And he listened to 2 7-year-olds talk at full volume about things he did not entirely follow, and he felt more at home than he had in 4 years. After the other children had gone, Wren put on her coat and boots without being asked and went out to the fence. Rust was there. Isolde and Callum stood together on the porch and watched. Neither of them spoke. The early dark of November was settling over the field, and the horse was a shape in the dimness, still close to the fence. And Wren sat on the bottom rail and held her stuffed horse and said something that neither adult could hear. And then Rust took 2 steps forward and lowered his head over the fence and pressed his nose gently against the top of Wren's head. He held it there for a moment, not moving, just the warm weight of him resting on her hair. Wren did not move either. She did not reach up. She did not make a sound. She simply received it, the way children sometimes receive things that adults have forgotten how to receive, without analysis, without needing to name it. Then Rust lifted his head and stepped back, and Wren turned around and looked at her mother with an expression that I spent a long time trying to find the right word for. It was not surprise. It was not excitement. It was something quieter and more certain than either of those things. The expression of someone who has been waiting for something they already knew was coming. Petra came back in December to do a full health assessment on Rust, which Callum had requested and which Rust, unexpectedly, allowed. He stood still while she examined him, moved when she asked him to move, and regarded the whole process with the particular tolerance of an animal that has decided to permit something rather than an animal that has been forced to submit to it. Petra noted this distinction carefully. She found nothing wrong with him. She found a horse in excellent condition, alert, carrying no signs of previous injury beyond the old shoulder scar. She noted his age as somewhere between 8 and 12 years based on his teeth, which meant he had spent the majority of his life without human contact. She told Callum, on her way back to her truck, that she had been working with horses for 30 years, and that what she had seen over the past weeks, what Callum had described to her about the behavior at the creek, and the gradual approach to the fence, and the contact with Wren, was not outside the range of what horses were capable of. Horses perceived distress. Horses perceived temperature change, and the particular stillness of an unconscious body, differently than the stillness of a sleeping one. Horses were social animals with complex responses to vulnerability in other creatures. She said all of this, and then she paused, which was not something Petra did often. She said, and he might hear what he wanted in this, that in 30 years she had seen horses do things that the science of horse behavior could describe the mechanism of, without fully accounting for the why. She said that what Rust had done at the creek, the specific choices he had made, staying, positioning, waiting, were within the documented range of equine behavior. Say, she, that. And then she said that she had a hard time explaining, within that same documented range, how he had known to be there in the first place. She got in her truck. She drove away. Callum stood in his yard for a long time after her taillights disappeared. The sleepwalking did not return after that night in the creek. Isolde waited for it, braced for it, lay awake on the nights when Wren was restless, listening for any sound of movement in the hallway. But it did not come back. Whether it had run its course, or whether something had changed, she had no way of knowing. The pediatrician said these things resolved on their own. Isolde nodded and said, yes, that seemed right. She kept the window latch checked every night. She kept the back door locked with the high lock. She kept doing these things, not out of fear, but out of the particular vigilance of a mother who has understood, at a creek bank on an October morning, exactly how much she has to lose. In Tea Spring, Callum built a gate between his property and Isolde's that could be opened from both sides. He said it was for practical reasons. Isolde said yes, of course. That made sense. Neither of them said anything else about it. Wren spent part of most afternoons at the fence, and then, gradually, in the field. Callum was with her the first time she walked into Rust's space. Not leading her, not directing her. Just present the way you are present with someone doing something important. Rust watched them approach. He did not move. He allowed Wren to reach out and place her small hand on his shoulder, and he stood there with the particular stillness of something that has made a decision and is at peace with it. She kept her palm flat, the way Callum had shown her. She stood close to him and felt the warmth that horses carry even in cold air, that deep organic heat that goes beyond body temperature into something that feels like intention. She stood there for a long time. Harlan took a photograph that day. He hadn't meant to, had just had his phone out for something else, and then suddenly there was a moment that asked to be kept. He printed it and gave it to Isolde, slightly shy about it, and Isolde put it on the wall in the hallway. In it, Wren is 7 years old, her cheek pressed against Rust's neck, her eyes closed. She is holding her stuffed horse loosely at her side, the small, worn, reddish-brown toy she has slept with since she was 11 days old. And Rust is looking at something beyond the frame, beyond the fence, and the field, and the ordinary January morning. His eyes focused on a distance that has no name, with an expression that no one standing there that day could read or explain or account for. Only recognize. The way you recognize something you have known about for a long time, without having words for it. That photograph is still on the wall. Wren is older now. She knows things about horses that she has learned deliberately, with effort and time and guidance, things that can be taught. But there is something else she knows that came to her differently, something she holds without explaining it. The way you hold a thing that was given to you before you were old enough to ask what it meant. She still sleeps with a stuffed horse. She will tell you, if you ask her, that she knows it sounds like a coincidence. She will tell you she is not sure coincidence is always the right word. And then she will look at you the way she looked at Isolde that evening on the fence. The expression that is not surprise and not excitement, but something quieter and more certain than either. The kind of look that suggests she has known something for a very long time, something she is still deciding how to say.